She had nothing left. No money, no name, no reason to stop walking. But then she heard a baby screaming inside a dying house, and something in her chest cracked open like old wood under too much weight. She told herself she'd stay 1 hour, maybe two. That was 6 months ago. And now the man she never meant to love was standing in a frozen doorway, staring at her across a room full of secrets, while his brother pressed a knife of truth against everything she'd quietly built. Some women run from their pasts. Evelyn Mercer had been running her entire life. Tonight, the running stopped. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The truck stop outside Rawlins, Wyoming had a hand-painted sign above the restroom door that read, "No loitering, no exceptions." Evelyn Mercer had been staring at that sign for 40 minutes. She wasn't loitering, she was deciding. There was a difference, at least that's what she told herself while she nursed a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and calculated for the fourth time exactly how many miles stood between her and the next town with a shelter that might take a woman without ID. 17 miles. On foot, in late October, in Wyoming, that number wasn't a distance, it was a sentence. The woman behind the counter, name tag read. Darlene, letters rubbed half off, had stopped pretending not to watch her. Every few minutes, Darlene would wipe down the same stretch of counter, sliding one slow circle with a gray cloth, eyes cutting sideways without quite meeting Evelyn's. Evelyn didn't blame her. She knew what she looked like. The reflection in the window said enough. Hair pulled back into something that had been a bun 3 days ago and was now just held together by stubbornness. A canvas jacket with a torn pocket. She'd safety pinned shut in a gas station bathroom somewhere outside Laramie. Boots that had been resoled twice and were asking, quietly, to be retired. The travel bag on the floor beside her stool had a broken zipper and was held closed with a bungee cord she'd found on the highway shoulder. She was 31 years old and looked, she suspected, closer to 40. Refill? Evelyn looked up. Darlene was standing right in front of her now, pot in hand, expression carefully neutral. That particular brand of neutral that truck stop workers and ER nurses develop. The kind that doesn't commit to judgment or sympathy, because it's genuinely unsure which one fits. Please, Evelyn said. Thank you, Darlene poured. Then, without being asked, she slid a small plate across the counter. 2 biscuits. A little cup of butter. End of the day, Darlene said. We're going to toss them anyway. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. She ate both biscuits without tasting them, chewing mechanically, staring at the laminated map they had tacked to the wall beside the register. One of those old promotional maps with cartoon cattle and little illustrated mountains. Someone had drawn a star on it in black pen, middle of nowhere, labeled it here, unfortunately. A rancher sitting 2 stools down from her laughed at something on his phone, then caught her looking at the map and followed her gaze. You lost? He asked. Not unkind, just direct, the way people out here tended to be. No, she said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they don't believe you but have the decency not to push. He dropped some bills on the counter and pulled his coat on. Before he left, he hesitated, just briefly, then turned back. Hollow Creek Ranch is about 4 miles east on Route 12, he said. Caleb Hale runs it. He's been short-handed since his wife passed. Wouldn't hurt to ask. I was gone before she could respond. Evelyn looked at the map. 4 miles east. She sat there another 10 minutes, letting the coffee work its way through her. Then she stood up, slung the bag over her shoulder, tucked the bungee cord tighter, and walked out into the Wyoming cold. The road into Hollow Creek Ranch was exactly as terrible as it looked. It wasn't really a road, more like a suggestion. 2 tire ruts pressed into dried grass and clay, winding between fence posts that leaned at different angles like old men who'd stopped caring about posture. The sky above was the color of dirty dishwater, flat and heavy, pressing down on the plains like it had somewhere else to be and was irritated at the delay. Wind came in sideways off the plains, the kind that found every gap in a jacket and took its time. Evelyn walked with her head down and her hands shoved into her pockets, counting steps out of habit. Something she'd done since she was a kid, when counting things helped make the world feel like it had some order to it. She got to about 3,000 before she heard the sound. She stopped walking. The wind shifted, and there it was, distant but clear, cutting straight through the cold like a blade. A baby crying. Not the casual fussing kind. Not the drowsy, half-asleep kind. This was the kind of crying that came from somewhere desperate, somewhere past tired, a sound that seemed to press against the walls of whatever contained it and spill out into the open air like it couldn't help itself. Evelyn stood completely still for a moment. She had a rule about getting involved with strangers' problems. It had evolved over years and several hard lessons into something almost like a physical reflex. A tightening across her shoulders, a pull toward the next road, the next town, the next place that wasn't here. The crying rose sharply, then broke off into a kind of gasping wail. She started walking again, faster. The ranch house materialized out of the gray afternoon like something half remembered from a bad dream. It had been a decent house once. You could see the architecture of that, the bones of it. Wraparound porch, wide-set windows, a stone chimney at each end. But somewhere along the way, the maintenance had stopped keeping up with the weather, and Wyoming weather was not the forgiving kind. The porch railing on the left side had collapsed and been replaced with a length of rope tied between two posts. One window was boarded from the outside with plywood that had warped and lifted at one corner. The paint had given up so thoroughly that you couldn't really say what color it had been. A pickup truck sat in the yard, mid-90s, primer gray, one headlight visibly cracked. Next to it, a stock trailer with a bad wheel. Near the barn, two horses stood in a paddock with low feed, heads down, not particularly interested in anything. The crying was coming from inside the house. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, which creaked under her like it was lodging a complaint. She knocked on the door, waited. Knocked again, harder. The door swung open. The man standing there looked like he hadn't slept in a week and had stopped expecting sleep in the near future. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with wide shoulders that had the kind of permanent forward set that comes from years of physical labor. Dark hair that needed cutting, jaw that needed a razor. Maybe mid-30s, though exhaustion added years. He was wearing a flannel shirt with a button missing at the collar, and a look in his eyes that was somewhere between suspicious and just plain hollowed out. I was holding a baby. The baby was screaming. "Whatever you're selling," the man said, raising his voice over the noise. "I don't want it." "I'm not selling anything," Evelyn said. "I heard her from the road." The man, Caleb Hale, she would learn, looked at her for a long moment. The baby arched her back and screamed harder, red-faced, inconsolable, small fists clenched. "She won't stop," he said. Something in his voice had cracked a little on those 3 words. Not breaking down, he was too stubborn for that, but cracked, the way wood cracks before it actually splits. "Been at it 2 hours. I don't know what she—" "Can I?" He blinked. "Can you what?" "Hold her." He stared at her. Evelyn met his eyes and didn't look away. She wasn't sure why she was doing this. She wasn't sure about much of anything at that particular moment, except that the baby sounded like she was in pain, and the man holding her looked about 30 seconds from falling apart. After a beat, Caleb held the baby out. Evelyn took her carefully, adjusting her grip, settling the infant against her left shoulder with the baby's cheek pressed gently to the side of her neck. She began to move, not bouncing, not rocking dramatically, just a slow, steady shifting of her weight from foot to foot, barely perceptible, while she pressed one hand flat and warm against the baby's back. The screaming didn't stop instantly. That was a movie thing, and this wasn't a movie. But it faltered, broke rhythm, shifted into something confused, then quieter, then eventually settled into a series of shaky, hiccuping breaths against Evelyn's shoulder. Silence fell over the porch like snow. Caleb Hale stood absolutely still. "How did you—" he started. "She was overheated," Evelyn said quietly. "The layers. And she's hungry. When did she eat last?" He ran a hand through his hair and looked somewhere over Evelyn's shoulder, toward the horizon, the way people look when they're searching for an answer they don't want to give. "I've been trying. She won't take the bottle right. The formula, I mix it the way the can says, but she—" "What temperature are you heating it to?" A pause. "I just— warm. On the stove. I run my wrist under it." "Okay." Evelyn shifted the baby gently. "That's probably fine, but if she's been working herself up this long, she's exhausted and stressed, and she might need a few minutes just to calm down before she can eat. Some babies do." He looked at her the way people look when someone says something that sounds reasonable, but they've been too deep in the dark to see it. Like they're not sure if the information is right, but they're too tired to doubt it. "I've got a 6-year-old inside," he said. "She's not— I haven't been able to—" Supper was supposed to be... He stopped, pinched the bridge of his nose. If you've got flour left, Evelyn said, I can save supper. His name was Caleb James Hale. He was 34 years old. He had run Hollow Creek Ranch with his wife, Margaret, for 7 years, and Margaret had died 11 months ago from a blood clot that formed in her leg after Clara's difficult delivery, moved to her lung on a Tuesday morning, and killed her by Thursday evening. She had been 29. Evelyn didn't learn all of that at once. She learned it in pieces over the course of that first evening, mostly from the 6-year-old, who was named Sadie, and turned out to be a very different kind of problem than the baby. Clara, once fed and cooled down and held in that particular way that Evelyn discovered worked, chin on shoulder, right hand flat between the shoulder blades, left hand cupped under the bottom, became manageable. Not easy. Babies were never easy, but manageable. She ate, she settled, she eventually drifted off with the boneless, total unconsciousness of infants, and Evelyn laid her in the old wooden cradle in the corner of the living room and stood over it for a moment, just making sure she was actually asleep. Sadie was another matter entirely. She was a small, pale child with dark eyes and dark hair, and the specific emotional posture of a kid who had decided, somewhere in the last 11 months, that getting attached to anything was a risk she wasn't going to take. She sat at the kitchen table when Evelyn came in, legs dangling because she was too short for the chair, watching with an expression that was carefully, deliberately blank. Hi, Evelyn said. Sadie said nothing. Evelyn went to the pantry and assessed the situation without comment. Things were low. Not disastrous, but low. There was flour, salt, baking powder, half a can of shortening, some dried beans that had been soaking in a bowl for unclear reasons, canned tomatoes, a chunk of salt pork wrapped in paper, and a collection of spices in various states of desiccation. She found a cast iron skillet under the counter and set it on the stove. You know how to cook? Sadie said. Her voice was small and flat and not particularly friendly. Some, Evelyn said. She opened the flour bag. Do you? Mama was teaching me biscuits. Then you can help. A pause. I don't want to. That's okay, Evelyn said. She didn't push it, didn't coax, didn't tell Sadie it would be fun or good for her or any of the things adults said to children when they were trying to manage them. She just measured out the flour and started working. She had learned to cook out of necessity, from a woman in a group house in Cheyenne who made a point of feeding people even when feeding them was difficult. The woman's name had been Dolores, and she had made biscuits every Sunday morning, whether anyone asked or not. And she had said once, without particular emphasis, that making food for people was one of the least complicated ways to tell them they mattered. Evelyn thought about Dolores fairly often. She had the biscuits in the oven and the beans on the stove and the salt pork in the skillet before Caleb came back inside from tending the horses. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the state of things. The flour-dusted counter, the smells, the fact that Sadie had migrated from the table to the counter and was watching the oven with the studied nonchalance of someone pretending they weren't interested. He looked at Evelyn. I haven't thanked you, he said. Don't, she said. Sit down. You look like you're going to fall over. He sat down. He looked, up close and in kitchen light, even more worn than he had on the porch. There were shadows under his eyes that had become permanent fixtures. His hands, resting on the table, were calloused and raw at the knuckles. Working hands, the kind that didn't get a break because the work didn't either. You got a name? He asked. Evelyn? Caleb, he said. Caleb Hale. I know. Rancher at the truck stop told me. He nodded slowly. Decker, probably. Talks to everyone. He said you were short-handed. That's one way to put it. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. It was empty, had probably been empty for a while. It's just me. My brother comes around sometimes, but He stopped. It's just me. Evelyn pulled the biscuits out of the oven. They had risen more than she expected, given the altitude and the age of the baking powder. She set them on the counter and checked the beans. I can work, she said. It wasn't exactly a question, and it wasn't exactly a statement. It was something that existed in the space between, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He looked at her. Really looked. Not the quick assessment he'd done on the porch. She let him. She'd learned over the years that people needed to look when they were deciding whether to trust someone, and trying to hurry that process along or deflect it usually made it worse. I don't know you, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if I can be useful for a little while. I was quiet for a moment. Sadie had migrated even closer to Evelyn's side of the counter, though she'd die before admitting it. There's a room in the back, Caleb said finally. It's not much. There's a cot and a lamp. That's plenty, Evelyn said. She set the table. He didn't tell her where anything was, but she found it all: plates on the second shelf, forks in the second drawer, glasses in the cabinet above the sink. She put out 3 settings, then hesitated and added a small plate and a partial glass for Sadie, the way Dolores used to do. Sadie noticed, sat down without being asked. They ate in the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was tired, and tired is different. The biscuits were good. Caleb ate 2.5 of them and looked mildly surprised at himself. These are better than mine, Sadie said. It was the first thing she'd said at the table. Evelyn just nodded. Your mama might have had a different recipe. Show me sometime. Sadie looked at her plate, said nothing, but she didn't disagree. The room in the back was small, low-ceilinged, and cold in the way that rooms get when they've been closed up too long. The cot had a mattress that had seen better decades and a wool blanket that smelled like cedar and dust. There was a window that faced east toward the open plains, and through it Evelyn could see the sky beginning to dark from gunmetal gray to something closer to ink. She sat on the edge of the cot with her bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap and looked at the room for a while. She had stayed in worse places, considerably worse. There had been a stretch in her mid-20s when worse would have been a generous description of the situations she'd found herself in. Shelter cots, a truck bed for 3 weeks once, a church basement in Casper where they made you attend services for the privilege of the floor. This was a room with a door that closed, with walls that held heat, with a family on the other side that had, for one evening at least, stopped falling apart quite so loudly. She didn't let herself think beyond that. She had learned, the hard way, that thinking too far ahead was dangerous. Tomorrow morning she would wake up, and there would be work to do, and she would do it, and that was enough. She unzipped her bag, bungee cord first, and took out the few things inside. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, a small photograph folded in thirds that she put face down on the windowsill without looking at, a worn paperback that she'd read 3 times and carried anyway, and at the bottom, wrapped in a dish towel she'd been using as a substitute for several things it wasn't designed for, a small amount of cash. $43 and some change. Enough for a bus ticket to somewhere, if it came to that. She rewrapped it carefully and put it back at the bottom. She lay down on the cot without undressing, old habit, and pulled the wool blanket over her and stared at the ceiling in the dark. Somewhere in the house, Clara made a small sound in her sleep. A content sound. The kind that meant nothing was wrong. Evelyn closed her eyes. She was up before 4, not because anyone woke her. Nobody had. It was just the way her body worked, had worked for years. Whatever mechanism most people had that allowed them to sleep through an alarm, through noise, through the general resumption of the world, that mechanism in Evelyn had been replaced with something else. Something that pushed her upright at the first gray hint of dawn with the specific urgency of a person who has spent too long not being able to afford stillness. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the cleaner of her 2 shirts, and went quietly through the house. Clara was beginning to stir in the cradle but hadn't fully woken yet. Evelyn scooped her up before she could build to a full cry, and they had a private exchange in the kitchen's early morning quiet. Clara with her wide, unfocused newborn eyes tracking shapes and light. Evelyn making the formula the right way this time, testing it on her inner wrist twice. Yeah, she said softly to the baby specifically, and no one in particular. I know. Cold house, no routine, some stranger holding you. You've had a rough go of it, kid. Clara regarded her with what might have been assessment. I get it, Evelyn said. She fed her, changed her, put her back down. Then she looked at the kitchen. The kitchen needed work, not just cleaning, though it needed that too. A particular kind of accumulation had happened in the months since Caleb had been doing it alone, the kind that isn't laziness so much as despair. Dishes washed but stacked wrong. Surfaces wiped but not scrubbed. The pantry organized by someone who'd stopped caring where things went as long as they were somewhere. It was the kitchen of a person keeping things from becoming completely undone through sheer stubbornness, without quite having the capacity for anything beyond that. Evelyn started from the back and worked forward. She found cleaning supplies under the sink, a bottle of dish soap mostly empty, baking soda, a good scrub brush. She filled the sink with hot water and started on the shelving, She wasn't making noise about it. She wasn't performing anything. She just cleaned steadily and methodically, the way she had learned to approach most things. Decide on the sequence, work the sequence, don't think past the current step. By the time she heard Caleb's feet on the stairs at 5:30, she had the shelves done, the counter scrubbed, and a pot of oatmeal on the stove. He stopped at the kitchen doorway the same way he had the night before, but the expression was different this morning, less startled, more something else that he didn't put a name to. You didn't have to. Clara's sleeping, Evelyn said. Oatmeal's in 10. There's coffee. He sat down without further comment and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. He looked more human than he had the previous evening, still wrecked by sleep deprivation, still carrying the permanent weight of someone who hadn't had a break in almost a year, but marginally more oriented to the world. I'm going to fix the porch railing today, Evelyn said, ladling oatmeal into bowls. If that's all right with you. He looked at her. You do repairs? Some. I can at least get it stable. The rope is a liability with Sadie running around. He nodded slowly. There's lumber in the barn, left side near the door. Good. They ate in quiet for a few minutes. Somewhere upstairs a door opened and Sadie's footsteps, recognizable because she walked heavy for her size, flat-footed, like someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful about the noise she made, came down the stairs and stopped at the kitchen doorway. She was wearing a flannel nightgown and had her hair in a single braid that had mostly come undone. She stood in the doorway looking at the kitchen, the way you might look at a room you expected to be dark, but wasn't. Why is it clean? She asked. Seemed like it wanted to be, Evelyn said. Sadie processed this. It was not a logical answer, and she was apparently a logical child. She looked at the oatmeal on the stove, then at her father, then at Evelyn. Mama put brown sugar in it, she said. Check the pantry, Evelyn said. Second shelf. Sadie went and checked and came back with the brown sugar. She put it on the table and sat down in the same chair she'd taken the night before, as if chairs worked by some property of ownership Evelyn didn't have access to. Don't make it too sweet, Caleb said quietly. He was looking at his bowl. I know, Sadie said. She sounded briefly about 40 years old. But the porch railing took most of the morning. The barn had lumber, as promised, some of it usable, some of it not. Evelyn sorted through it, pulling pieces that still had integrity, checking for rot along the grain, the way she'd been taught by a man named Garrett in a group home in her mid-teens who had done carpentry work on weekends and said it was cheaper than therapy and probably more effective. Garrett had been right about a lot of things. She found a handsaw on a peg in the barn and a box of nails and a hammer and worked on the porch through the morning. It was cold work. The October air had a real bite to it, and her hands were stiff enough in the first hour that she had to stop twice to press them under her arms until they warmed. But the work itself was satisfying in the mechanical way that physical work often was. The kind of satisfaction that doesn't require any emotional engagement and gives something back anyway. She had the new section framed in and the first rail mounted when she heard a horse coming up the drive. She straightened up and looked. The rider was a man about Caleb's age, but built differently. Broader across the chest, looser in the saddle, the kind of comfortable on a horse that speaks to years. He was good-looking in an angular, weathered way, with Caleb's dark coloring, but something harder in the jaw, something watchful in the eyes. He wore a duster coat that had seen weather and a hat pulled down against the wind. He brought his horse to a stop in the yard and looked at Evelyn standing on the porch with a hammer in her hand for a long moment before he spoke. Where's Caleb? Checking fence line on the north pasture, Evelyn said. Should be back by midday. The man looked at the half-repaired railing. Then he looked at Evelyn again, and this time something happened in his expression. A flicker, quick and gone. But she caught it. It wasn't recognition exactly. More like the echo of recognition. The feeling of a face that fit a frame somewhere in memory without the picture coming clear. You work here? He asked. For now, Evelyn said. He dismounted, fluid, practiced, and tied his horse to the hitching post near the barn. He walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. And this time the almost recognition was working harder in his eyes, trying to resolve itself. Wade Hale, he said. Evelyn, she said. Just the first name. He nodded. The expression didn't settle into anything friendlier. Caleb know you're here? I wouldn't be fixing his porch railing otherwise. He looked at the work again. Something in the way he was standing had changed. The shoulders, the set of the jaw. Still polite, technically. But the politeness was doing work now. It was being used to cover something. Decker's been talking, he said, more to himself than to her. The rancher at the truck stop. He talked to you too? Sent me in this direction, Evelyn said. Said Caleb was short-handed. Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the house, then at the barn, then finally back at her. When he looked at her this time, she had the clear and specific feeling of being assessed in a way that was more than just curiosity. There was something being calculated behind his eyes. I'll wait for Caleb, he said. Kitchen's open, Evelyn said. There's coffee on the stove. He went inside. Evelyn went back to the porch railing and finished it, hammering each nail with care, testing each board before she moved on. Her hands were steadier than she expected, but she was aware, with a clarity that felt like cold water on the back of the neck, that something had shifted in the morning air, that the flicker in Wade Hale's eyes was not nothing. She had spent too many years surviving on pattern recognition to dismiss a feeling like that. Caleb came back at 11:30 with mud to his knees and a fence problem that was going to need 2 days and more wire than he had, and the three of them ate lunch at the kitchen table while Clara slept and Sadie was at school, a small school 10 miles down the highway, where Caleb dropped her on Tuesdays and Thursdays on his way to get supplies. The conversation between the brothers was practical. Fence line, cattle count, winter stores, the condition of the water pump. Evelyn moved between the table and the stove, staying at the edges of it, not interjecting. She watched them, though, in the peripheral way she'd developed for watching people. The set of Caleb's shoulders when Wade spoke, the particular angle of Wade's attention when he thought no one was paying attention. Once, while Caleb was talking about the water pump, Wade looked at Evelyn. It was a look she understood. She'd seen variations of it her entire adult life. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it held a kind of message, delivered without words, the kind that said, I haven't placed you yet, but I will. She met it calmly and looked away first, back to the stove. After lunch, Wade stayed to help with the fencing. She could hear them out in the north pasture through the afternoon. The knock of posts and the thin sound of voices carried sideways on the wind. She spent the afternoon reorganizing the pantry properly, doing a laundry that had needed doing for an unclear number of days, and getting Sadie started on homework when the school bus dropped her at the top of the drive at 3:15. Sadie had homework about state capitals, which was apparently contentious. I don't care where Cheyenne is, Sadie said flatly. You're in Wyoming, Evelyn said. Cheyenne is your state capital. It seems like relevant information. It's far away. Most things are. Evelyn sat down across from her and pointed at the worksheet. Finish this and I'll show you how to make proper cornbread. Sadie looked at the worksheet, then at Evelyn. What's proper cornbread? The kind worth finishing homework for. Sadie picked up her pencil. Wade found her behind the barn as the sun was going down. She'd gone out to check on the horses. Caleb had asked her to, on his way to get Sadie's bathwater heated, a specific Wyoming ranch request that made complete sense when she understood that the hot water heater was intermittent. She was refilling the water trough from the well when she heard his boots on the hard ground behind her and the particular silence of someone who has made a decision about a conversation. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished filling the trough, set the bucket down, and then turned. He was standing about 6 feet away with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had been thinking hard all day and had arrived somewhere he didn't particularly like. How long ago was it? He said. Not quite a question. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I don't know what you're referring to. Yeah, you do. His jaw worked slightly. Benton County. About 6 years back. You were going by a different name, but the face doesn't change that much. The cold came up around her slowly, from the ground up. She'd thought about this possibility. Not here, not specifically Hollow Creek, but the generic version of it, the possibility of a place where someone knew. She'd lived with that possibility for 6 years. That has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with my brother, Wade said. His voice was low and flat, not angry in the hot way. In the cold way, which was worse. He's got 2 daughters. He's already been through things I wouldn't wish on a man twice. And he doesn't know who he's let into his house. He knows enough, Evelyn said. He knows nothing. She held his gaze. What happened in Benton County wasn't... I know what happened in Benton County, Wade said. I was there. I saw the aftermath. She was quiet. He stepped closer, not threatening, just asserting proximity, making sure she understood he was serious. "You leave," he said quietly, "before I have to be the one to tell him, before Sadie gets any more attached than she already is. Better for everyone." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, then she looked back at the house. Through the kitchen window, warm and yellow against the early dark, she could see Sadie standing on a step stool at the counter, earnestly watching something on the stove. And behind her, she could just barely make out the shape of Caleb moving through the room, checking on Clara in her cradle, the particular careful walk of a man who'd learned to move quietly around sleeping children. "You should go inside," Wade said. "Think about what I said." He walked away. Evelyn stayed by the water trough in the dark for a long time, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her hands not quite steady. The plains stretched out behind the barn in every direction, vast and flat and indifferent, and she knew every road out of here. She'd mapped them, automatically, the way she always did in a new place. Old habit, old survival. Running had always been easier. She stood in the dark and thought about Dolores making biscuits on Sunday mornings, about a fold of $43 at the bottom of a bag, about Sadie's flat-footed walk on the stairs and the weight of Clara settling against her shoulder and going quiet. She thought about how many times she had left. After a while, she walked back to the house. She went through the back door, into the warm kitchen, and Sadie looked up from the stove where the cornbread was starting to smell right. "Did I do it wrong?" Sadie asked. "No," Evelyn said. "You did it exactly right." She hung her jacket on the hook by the door, washed her hands, went to stand next to Sadie at the stove, close enough to reach the skillet if the heat got away from her. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over Hollow Creek like a hand pressed firmly over everything. And inside the kitchen, something fragile and small and not yet named continued to hold. The cornbread came out uneven on one side because the skillet had a hot spot Evelyn hadn't accounted for yet, and Sadie pointed this out with the specific satisfaction of a child identifying an adult's mistake. "That side's darker," she said. "That side tastes the same," Evelyn said. Sadie ate 2 pieces of it. That was the thing about the days that followed. They weren't graceful. Nothing about the Hale Ranch operated gracefully, and Evelyn had stopped expecting grace from her own life a long time ago. What happened instead was something more incremental and less pretty. A slow accumulation of small repairs, small routines, small moments that didn't mean much individually, but were starting, collectively, to mean something. Mornings, Evelyn was up before 4. She fed Clara while Caleb slept the extra hour he clearly needed, though he always seemed guilty about it when he came downstairs and found her already in motion. She made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way she'd learned in a diner outside Rawlins where the morning shift started at 4:30, and nobody had time to be delicate about caffeine. She learned which burner on the stove ran hot and which one lagged. She learned that the back door stuck after rain and needed a shoulder to open it, and that the window in the main bedroom let in a draft that Caleb had been stuffing with a folded dish towel since sometime in September. She replaced the dish towel with a strip of weather stripping she found in the barn and didn't mention it. Caleb noticed. He didn't say anything directly. He wasn't a man who led with sentiment, but a few days later she came in from hanging laundry to find her work boots, which had been deteriorating steadily and losing the argument against Wyoming clay, sitting by the back door resoled with new rubber. No note, no comment, just the boots, fixed, set where she'd find them. She stood looking at them for a moment. "He does that," Sadie said from the kitchen table, not looking up from her book. "Fixes things without saying anything." "I noticed," Evelyn said. "He fixed Mama's sewing machine for a whole month before she noticed," Sadie said. "She thought it just got better on its own." It was the most Sadie had said about her mother in the 2 weeks Evelyn had been at the ranch. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children sometimes discuss grief. Not around it, just through it, no ceremony, the information delivered the same way you'd report on the weather. Then she turned a page and went back to reading. Evelyn put on the boots and went back outside. The days had their shape now. Mornings were Clara and the kitchen and getting Sadie ready for school on the days she went. Afternoons were the work, and there was always work. She mended clothes that had been sitting in a pile in the laundry room for unclear months, using a needle and thread she found in a tin in Margaret's old sewing basket, which she'd asked Caleb's permission to open, and which he'd given in a way that suggested the question had cost him something. She patched a section of the roof over the back porch where water had been coming in. She was not a professional roofer. She was not a professional anything, but she'd been on enough roofs to know how tar paper and flashing worked, and she did the job well enough that the next rain stayed outside. Caleb watched her come down the ladder after that particular project with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked. "Here and there," she said. He looked like he had more questions. He didn't ask them. That was the arrangement they'd settled into without discussing it. A mutual decision, apparently arrived at independently, to stay at the surface of things. She did the work, he did his work. They shared the table and occasionally a few words about practical matters, and neither of them reached past that. It was comfortable in its limitations. She appreciated that he didn't pry, and she suspected he appreciated that she didn't push at his grief, didn't say the things people said. Time heals, and she'd want you to be happy, and all the other well-meaning nonsense that people deployed when they didn't know what else to offer. What she offered instead was a functioning kitchen and a railing that didn't wobble. Sadie, for her part, remained constitutionally suspicious of kindness, but was losing the battle against it in small increments. She started doing her homework at the kitchen table instead of in her room. She started commenting on Evelyn's cooking, critically, specifically, in a way that was somehow more intimate than praise would have been. She taught Evelyn what her mother had used instead of paprika in the bean soup, which turned out to be a combination of cumin and something she called the red one, that took Evelyn a day to identify as ancho chili powder. She corrected Evelyn's cornbread once more, then stopped correcting it, which Evelyn understood to mean it had passed some private standard. She didn't smile at Evelyn. Not yet. But she stopped leaving the room when Evelyn entered it. That was something. Wade did not come back for 10 days. When he did, it was on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky had gone the particular shade of gray that Wyoming sky went in late October, pressing down low over the plains like it was deciding whether to commit to something. Evelyn heard his horse in the yard and kept doing what she was doing, folding laundry on the kitchen table, and waited. He came to the back door this time instead of the front. She heard him knock, heard Caleb's voice from somewhere in the house, and then the sound of them talking in the yard. She couldn't make out words. She didn't try. She folded a flannel shirt and set it on the pile and started on the next one. After about 20 minutes, the back door opened and Caleb came in alone. He poured himself a coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, looking out the window. His jaw was set in the way it got when something was working at him. "Wade thinks I'm being naive," he said. "About what?" Evelyn asked, though she had a good idea. "About the general situation." He turned his mug in his hand. "About you being here." She kept folding. "What do you think?" I was quiet for a moment. "I think Clara's sleeping through most of the night now. I think Sadie ate supper without a fight 4 nights in a row." He paused. "I think the back porch doesn't leak anymore." "That's not an answer to my question." "I know." He set the mug down and turned to look at her directly. He did that. Looked at people straight, without flinching or deflecting, which she'd come to understand was just how he was built. "Wade says you're from somewhere complicated." His word, complicated. Evelyn put the shirt down. "That's accurate enough. He says I should know more about who I've brought into my house." He wasn't accusatory. His voice was level, careful, like a man testing ice. "He might be right about that." "He might be," Evelyn said. "So, is there something I should know?" She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Just the low sound of Clara in the next room, breathing in the easy rhythm of a baby who had recently been fed. "There are things in my past," Evelyn said. "Things I'm not proud of. Nothing that should put your daughters at risk." She paused. "I understand if that's not enough." He held her gaze for a long moment. She'd learned in those 2 weeks that his silences were not empty. They were where he actually thought, where he ran things through whatever internal process he had before he committed to a position. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said. "All right." He picked his mug back up. "I've got a fence section down on the south pasture. 2 of the Herefords got through last night. I'm going to need to bring them back in before the weather turns." It was a closing of the subject. Not a permanent one. She didn't think it was permanent, but for today, he was done with it. He was choosing, deliberately, to move forward rather than push further, and she wasn't sure what to do with that except accept it. "I can start on supper early," she said. "There's a chicken that needs to be used." "Sadie likes it roasted," he said. "I know," Evelyn said, and went back outside. She stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, hands still resting on the stack of folded laundry, and breathed once, slowly, all the way out. Then she went to find the chicken. The real trouble with Wade wasn't the confrontation behind the barn, or the one relayed through Caleb in the kitchen. The real trouble was subtler than that, and Evelyn recognized it because she'd dealt with subtler her whole life. It was that he was right, that she was carrying something, and she could feel, with a growing and specific dread, the weight of it starting to press against the surface of things here at Hollow Creek, in a way it hadn't in years. In years of moving, and she had moved a lot, from town to town across the interior of Wyoming, and once briefly into Colorado. She'd stayed mostly anonymous. You could maintain anonymity in motion. Staying still was different. Staying still meant people had time to remember where they'd seen a face before. Wade had placed her. She didn't know how much, specifically, he remembered. What she knew was that Benton County 6 years ago had been the worst 18 months of her life, and the end of a chapter she'd thought, had made herself believe, was truly closed. She wasn't going to tell Caleb what had happened there. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if the stain was temporary. She still wasn't entirely sure the stain wasn't temporary. What she was sure of was that she couldn't keep avoiding it the way she'd been avoiding it, in the mental sense. The deliberate not looking at it, the way you didn't look directly at a wound that needed cleaning, because cleaning it would mean acknowledging how bad it was. She thought about this in the evenings after Sadie was in bed, and Clara was settled, and Caleb was in the front room with his account books, which appeared to be a source of ongoing quiet despair. She sat in the back room on the cot with the photograph that she kept face down and thought about Benton County and about the specific shape of the mistake she'd made there, which had not been a simple mistake. Simple mistakes were recoverable. What had happened in Benton County was a chain, a series of decisions, each one made from a position of desperation and poor judgment that had wrapped itself around her life and tightened. She had served 8 months of it in a county facility. She had been 25. She had come out on the other side of it thinner and cleaner and with a clarity of purpose that was essentially just never go back to anything like that again. Don't use people. Don't let people use you. Don't stay anywhere long enough to matter, because mattering created vulnerability, and vulnerability was a vector for the kind of harm she'd already absorbed enough of. And then she'd walked 4 miles down a highway in Wyoming and heard a baby screaming. She picked up the photograph and looked at it. It was old now. The paper had softened at the folds, the image a little blurred. A woman and a younger Evelyn, standing outside what appeared to be a diner, squinting in summer sun. The woman was Dolores. The diner had been in Cheyenne, and it had closed 3 years ago. She hadn't gone to Dolores's funeral when she heard about it because she'd been in the middle of nothing in particular, in a town nobody would remember, and funerals were attended by people who were allowed to grieve in public, and she hadn't been sure she qualified. She regretted it. In the vague and persistent way she regretted several things, not acutely enough to be undone by, just consistently enough to be aware of. She put the photograph back face down and lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling. From the kitchen, she could hear the soft sound of Caleb shutting his account books, the creak of the floor as he checked on Clara, the particular quiet of the house at 10 o'clock, a house settling into itself, breathing. She thought, I should leave before this gets any harder. Then she thought, it's already harder. Then she stopped thinking about it and went to sleep. It was Sadie who cracked first. Not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture in the wall she'd built around herself, the kind that starts at a specific point of pressure. And the specific point of pressure, when it came, was a Wednesday morning before school when she came downstairs and found Evelyn at the kitchen table helping Clara practice the kind of extended tummy time the health book in the back cupboard said she should be doing. And Clara was making the noise she made during tummy time, which was a sustained, slightly outraged grunt. And Evelyn was talking to her in the low, unhurried voice she used with the baby. I know, Evelyn was saying. It's undignified. You're doing great, though. You lifted your head for 3 whole seconds. Clara grunted again. That is genuinely impressive, and I mean that. Sadie stood in the doorway watching this for a moment, and something about the watching softened her face in a way she didn't catch herself doing in time to prevent. When Evelyn looked up and saw her, Sadie looked immediately at the floor. She hates that, Sadie said. She hates it, and she needs it, Evelyn said. Those are not mutually exclusive things. Sadie considered this with the seriousness of a child encountering a new philosophical principle. She came into the kitchen and crouched down to look at Clara at eye level. Clara, apparently deciding that Sadie's arrival was adequate justification for quitting tummy time, immediately rolled onto her side. She's getting stronger, Sadie said. She is. Evelyn sat back. She lifted her head about an inch this morning. That's new. Sadie touched Clara's hand carefully with 2 fingers, and Clara immediately gripped them in her small fist with the thoughtless, total grip that infants had. Sadie looked at her sister's face, the wide, unfocused eyes, the slow working of the mouth, and for a moment her expression was completely open, all the careful flatness gone. Just a 6-year-old girl looking at her baby sister with love so large it didn't know where to put itself. She looks like Mama sometimes, Sadie said quietly. Around the eyes. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. She just sat with it, the way you sat with things that were true and painful. After a moment, Sadie straightened up and said, in her regular flat voice, "I need my hair braided. I can't do the back." "Come here," Evelyn said. She braided Sadie's hair at the kitchen table while Clara lay on her back on the blanket and regarded the ceiling with deep philosophical interest. Sadie sat straight-backed and still, chin lifted, a child who had been taught proper posture and retained it even when everything else fell apart. Evelyn worked carefully, dividing the sections evenly, keeping tension even all the way through. "Not too tight," Sadie said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Mama always did it too tight." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm doing it loose." Sadie was quiet for a moment, then, "How did you know that?" "You mentioned it once, about 3 weeks ago." Another silence. "You remembered that?" "I remember things people tell me," Evelyn said. "It's something I'm good at." She tied off the braid and Sadie reached back to feel it with her fingers, checking, assessing, and then dropped her hand. She didn't say it was good, but she didn't say it needed to be redone either, which Evelyn had come to understand was the highest available endorsement. "Okay," Sadie said. She got up and took her backpack from the hook by the door. Caleb appeared in the doorway with his truck keys and his coat. He looked at Sadie's hair and then at Evelyn, and the look lasted just a half-second longer than it needed to for a simple acknowledgement. "Ready?" he said to Sadie. "Obviously," Sadie said, and walked past him out the door. Caleb looked at Evelyn once more. There was something in it. Not a question exactly, and not gratitude exactly either. Just a look that said, "I see what you're doing here." And then he followed his daughter out. Evelyn sat on the floor next to Clara and let out a slow breath. Outside, the truck started and crunched down the gravel drive. The ranch went quiet except for the wind, which had picked up overnight and was moving across the plains in long horizontal sheets that bent the dry grass flat. November was 5 days away. The cold was getting serious. She looked at Clara. "Don't look at me like that," she said. Clara blinked. "I know," Evelyn said. "I know." She picked the baby up carefully and held her against her chest, and Clara settled her cheek against Evelyn's shoulder the way she always did now, automatically, without fuss, as if this was simply where she belonged. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the plains, at the gray sky pressing down, at the fence line in the distance where she'd watched Caleb work for days, replacing wire and posts, alone, with the particular dogged patience of a man who had run out of other options. She thought about Wade. She thought about what he knew and what he was going to do with it. She thought about the $43 at the bottom of her bag, which she hadn't touched or counted in 2 weeks, which was longer than she'd gone without touching it since she'd started keeping it. The wind pushed against the window glass. Inside the kitchen, the house held its warmth. The first real storm of November came without much warning, the way Wyoming storms often did. Not sneaking in, but arriving with the blunt confidence of something that knew it owned the place. Evelyn had felt it coming all day in the way the air changed. Not dramatically, just a particular quality of stillness in the afternoon, the wind dropping off around 3 o'clock. The horses moving restless in the paddock like they were trying to put distance between themselves and something they could smell but not see. She'd brought in extra wood without being asked and filled the water containers in the kitchen and checked Clara's supply of formula. Old habits. She had spent enough winters in places with no backup heat to understand that preparation was the only leverage ordinary people had against weather. By 8 o'clock that night, the storm had made its intentions clear. It came in from the northwest, which was the worst direction out here. Nothing between the ranch and the Canadian border to slow it down, just 500 miles of open country that the wind had crossed at full speed. Freezing rain first, ticking against the windows like something trying to get in. Then the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like an hour, and the rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to a driving mix of ice and snow that made the windows useless for seeing anything beyond a few feet. Caleb had been out in the barn, securing the horses when it turned serious. He came back in at 8:30 with ice in his hair and his face drawn tight from the cold, and he stood in the kitchen doorway stripping off his outer layers and said nothing for a moment. That particular nothing was different from his usual silences. It had something urgent running underneath it. Forecast was wrong, he said. This is worse than they said. I know, Evelyn said. She was at the stove. Sit down, there's soup. He sat, but he didn't stop moving. His hands on the table, restless, his eyes going to the window every few seconds. The south fence section I repaired last week. If the ice loads up on the wire, it'll go down again. He paused. If I lose those Herefords in this, you can't go back out in this, Evelyn said. I know. He said it like a man who knew the right answer and was still arguing with it. He ate the soup without tasting it, she could tell, his spoon moving mechanically while his mind was somewhere out on the south pasture with cattle he couldn't get to. Sadie had been upstairs doing something she claimed was not homework, but probably was, in the specific way she had of doing the right thing while denying she was doing it. The storm brought her downstairs. The wind had found a gap somewhere in the eaves above her room and was making a sound she didn't like, low and intermittent, like something breathing. Is it bad? She asked from the stairwell. It's a storm, Caleb said. We've had worse. We haven't, Sadie said flatly. Caleb didn't correct her. They sat together in the kitchen through the first hour of it, the three of them and Clara in her cradle near the stove, which was the warmest place in the house. The power held, which was something. The generator in the barn was functional but would need to be started manually, and nobody wanted to go back out to the barn if they didn't have to. Evelyn was washing the soup bowls when she heard the sound that changed the night. It wasn't loud. That was the thing. It was almost quiet, which somehow made it worse. A low, labored breathing from Clara's cradle. Not the easy rhythm of a sleeping baby. Uneven. Too fast, then too slow, then fast again. She crossed to the kitchen in 3 steps and put her hand on Clara's face before she'd consciously decided to move. The heat hit her palm like an open oven. Caleb, she said. Her voice was controlled. She made it controlled. But something in the single word reached him, because he was out of his chair and beside her in an instant. He touched Clara's cheek and his face went the specific white of a person whose blood has just redirected all at once. How high? He said. Evelyn didn't have a thermometer. She looked around the kitchen with the fast inventory of a person trying to solve a problem in real time. I don't know. High. She needs to come down. Do you have medicine cabinet upstairs? He was already moving. Clara stirred in the cradle, making a sound that was not quite crying, something more defeated than crying, the sound of a body that didn't have the resources for full complaint. It was a worse sound than crying. Evelyn picked her up and held her against her chest, and felt the heat radiating through the layers of blanket and clothing. Hey, she said quietly. Hey, I've got you. Clara's eyes were open but not focused, tracking nothing in particular, and her small chest was working too hard for what breathing should cost. Evelyn kept her hand moving in that slow circle on the baby's back and thought very deliberately about what she knew, which wasn't enough, was nowhere near enough, and what she could do with it right now. Caleb came back with the infant medicine and a thermometer that he'd clearly not used in some time, and his hands were not steady. He got the thermometer under Clara's arm, and they waited the longest 30 seconds that either of them had experienced recently, and the reading came back at 104. Okay, Evelyn said, and her voice was still controlled, and she was very deliberately not letting him see that 104 on an infant was the number that had dropped the floor out from under her own stomach. Okay, the medicine first, then we need to cool her down a little. Lukewarm, not cold, and we need a doctor. Caleb looked at the window. The sleet was hitting the glass in waves, and beyond it there was nothing visible. No yard, no barn, just white moving dark. Closest is Doc Brewer in Milford, he said. 15 miles. Can you call him? I was already at the phone. He dialed and stood with his back to the wall, listening, and Evelyn could tell from the quality of his stillness when the call went to voicemail. He left a short, direct message. His name, Clara's symptoms, the temperature, his number. Then he called the emergency line for the county clinic in Milford and got a recording saying that due to weather conditions, response times were extended. He hung up and looked at her. I'll drive it, he said. Caleb, she needs a doctor. I'll drive it. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at Clara. She looked at the window. The roads are going to be... I know what the roads are going to be. He was already pulling his coat back on. I've driven them in worse. This might or might not have been true, but it was the kind of statement men made to themselves when they needed to be moving. Keep her cool. Keep the medicine in her. If her breathing gets worse, if she sounds like it's costing her more than this, call the county emergency line again and stay on hold. I will, Evelyn said. He stopped at the door. He looked at Evelyn holding his daughter, and for a moment everything in his face was completely readable. All the usual careful nothing stripped away, replaced by something raw and direct and frightened. Not the general fear of a man facing a hard situation. The specific fear of a man who had already lost one person he couldn't afford to lose and was looking at the possibility of losing another. I trust you with her, he said. It came out rough. Not as a speech. He wasn't built for speeches. Just as a statement of fact, said the way you'd say the road is icy, or the cattle are in the south pasture, flat and total and real. Go, Evelyn said. Be careful. He went. The truck started in the yard. She heard it through the storm, the engine catching, the wheels on gravel and then ice. And then the sound faded, and there was nothing but the wind and the sleet and the house. Sadie had been standing in the kitchen doorway for the last 5 minutes. Evelyn hadn't forgotten she was there. She'd been keeping Sadie in her peripheral vision the way you kept a fire in your peripheral vision, aware, tracking, ready. Is she dying? Sadie asked. No, Evelyn said. She has a fever. Babies get fevers. We're going to bring it down. Mama had a fever, Sadie said. Before she... This is different, Evelyn said. She said it firmly, not harshly. Clara is going to be all right. I need you to trust me on that. Sadie looked at her. It was the look of a child doing complicated math, weighing the available evidence, running it against past experience, arriving at an answer that was not yet certainty but might accept it provisionally. Okay, she said finally. I need a bowl of lukewarm water and a washcloth, Evelyn said. Not cold, lukewarm. Can you do that? Sadie was already moving. They worked together for the next hour. Evelyn held Clara and applied the cool cloths in rotation, watching for any change in the breathing, talking to the baby in the low, even voice she'd developed over the weeks here. Not the performed calmness of someone pretending to be calm, but the actual steadiness of someone who has found a task and is working it and will not stop working it. The medicine went in, protested briefly, stayed down. Clara cried for about 10 minutes, real crying this time, not the defeated sound from before, which Evelyn took as encouraging, and then dropped into a fitful half-sleep. Sadie sat across the table and watched everything with those dark, watchful eyes. And every few minutes she asked a question, not panicked questions, practical ones. What does the washcloth do? Why lukewarm and not cold? How long does medicine take? Evelyn answered each one directly, and in the answering, she could feel Sadie's fear redistributing itself, shifting from the formless terror of not knowing into something with edges, something that could be managed. Around 10 o'clock, the storm hit its worst. The power went first. Not dramatically, just a flicker, and then dark. The way electricity ended when the grid had finally had enough. Evelyn moved without hesitation to the drawer where she'd seen candles weeks ago. She'd inventoried the house the way she inventoried everywhere she stayed, cataloging exits and resources and useful objects, and had 3 of them lit before Sadie fully processed what had happened. The power's out, Sadie said. I know, Evelyn said. It'll come back. She wasn't certain of that. But the wood stove in the corner was already putting out enough heat to maintain the kitchen, and the candles gave enough light to work by, and Clara's breathing, by 10:30, had evened out marginally. The fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't climbed either, which Evelyn was choosing to treat as progress. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Clara against her chest and Sadie beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, which was the closest Sadie had physically come to her since she'd arrived, when the back door opened and Wade came in. I was covered in ice. It was in his hair, across his shoulders, on his eyebrows. He'd ridden in it. She didn't know from where. He had a place somewhere south of here, she'd gathered, though the specifics had never been offered. However far he'd come through the worst of the storm to get here. He looked at the candles, at Sadie, at Clara, in Evelyn's arms. He looked at all of it for a moment without speaking. Caleb went to get the doctor, Evelyn said. Wade nodded. He pulled off his outer layers at the door, methodical, not wasting motion, and then stood in the kitchen in flannel and denim and looked like a man making a decision. Generator's in the barn, he said. I can get it started. I know where it is, Evelyn said. I'll do it. He looked at her steadily. You stay with the girls. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something different in it tonight. Not the cold assessment from behind the barn. Not the calculating watchfulness of the kitchen visit. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had ridden through a storm to get to his brother's house and was not entirely sure why, and the uncertainty of it had stripped some of the hard edge off him. Okay, she said. He went back out. 10 minutes later, the lights came on, unsteady for a moment and then holding, and the refrigerator resumed its hum, and the house felt marginally less like it was being held together by will alone. Wade came back in and sat down at the table. He didn't sit across from Evelyn. He sat at the end, the same chair Caleb used. He poured himself a coffee from the pot that had stayed warm on the wood stove and drank half of it before anyone spoke. Temperature? He asked, nodding at Clara. 104 when Caleb left. Maybe a little less now. She's not climbing. He nodded. He looked at Sadie. You okay, kid? I'm fine, Sadie said, in the way she said everything. Flat, self-contained, a closed door. Sure, Wade said. He didn't push it. They sat in the kitchen with the storm pressing against every surface of the house, the wind finding harmonics in the eaves, the sleet still hitting the windows. Every few minutes, one of them checked on Clara. Her breathing continued its slow improvement. Not fast, not dramatic, but real. It was around midnight that Wade spoke again, and when he did, he spoke quietly and without looking at Evelyn directly. I remembered more, he said, about Benton County. Evelyn said nothing. I remembered the whole thing, actually. His voice was level. Not hostile, something more complicated than hostile. The people involved. The circumstances. Sadie had fallen asleep in her chair, head resting on her folded arms on the table, finally surrendered to the hour. Her hair was coming loose from the braid. Not all of it, just at the back near her neck, a few dark strands lying against her cheek. I know what you remember, Evelyn said quietly. Then you know what I could tell Caleb. I know. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he'd looked from his horse in the yard that first day, but without whatever calculation had been driving it before. He looked like a man taking an inventory that he wasn't entirely sure how to add up. Why are you still here? It was a genuine question. She could tell the difference. She looked at Sadie asleep at the table. She looked at Clara, breathing easier now, small face relaxed into sleep against her chest. I don't have a clean answer for that, Evelyn said. Try anyway. She was quiet for a moment. I've been leaving places my whole life. Leaving before things got difficult, mostly. Leaving before people had a chance to find out who I was. She shifted Clara slightly. I left a woman named Dolores when I should have stayed. I left other people too. I got good at the leaving part. She paused. This one's different. Why? Because I'm not leaving to protect myself, she said. I'd be leaving to make it easier to be gone, and that's not the same thing. Wade looked at his coffee mug. He turned it in his hands the same way Caleb did. She'd noticed that shared habit, the Hale brothers both turning mugs in their hands when they were thinking. Something inherited or just absorbed from years in the same rooms. What happened in Benton County was bad, he said. Yes. But I was there for some of it, he said slowly, and I knew some of the people involved. He stopped. I knew the man who put you in that position in the first place. Evelyn went very still. I didn't do anything about it then, Wade said, and his voice had roughened, the way voices roughened when they were carrying something that had been sitting in one place too long. I was 26, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I looked away. He set the mug down. You took the consequences for things that weren't all your fault. The storm pressed against the house. Outside, somewhere in the distance, something wooden gave way. A fence board, probably, or a barn shutter. And the sound of it was brief and final. Evelyn didn't speak for a long moment. She was very carefully not crying, because crying would require her to put Clara down, and she wasn't going to put Clara down. You don't have to say that, she said finally. I know I don't have to, Wade said. I'm saying it because it's true. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. There was too much in it for comfortable. But it was honest. Honesty was something. It was more, in Evelyn's experience, than most situations managed. The front door opened at midnight. Caleb came through it with a doctor behind him, a woman in her 60s named Brewer, who had clearly been pulled out of bed and driven 15 miles in a blizzard and was entirely professional about it in the way of someone who had done this before and would do it again. She checked Clara with efficient, unhurried hands while Caleb stood 2 feet away being barely functional. "Fever's coming down," Dr. Brewer said. "You've been managing it well." She looked at Evelyn. "You the one keeping her cool?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Good instincts." She wrote something on a small pad. "Keep up the medicine every 4 hours exactly. If she goes above 104 again, or if the breathing changes, you call me directly. Here's my cell, not the clinic line." She tore off the paper and handed it to Caleb. "She's going to be all right." Caleb put his hand over his face for a moment. Just briefly, the way men did when they were not going to cry in front of people but needed one unobserved second to not be in control of everything. Then he dropped it and nodded and thanked the doctor and walked her back to her truck through the storm. When he came back in, he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the scene. Wade at the table, Sadie asleep in her chair, Evelyn holding Clara with the baby's face finally slack and easy in deep sleep. He looked at all of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed the room and very carefully took Clara from Evelyn's arms, and Evelyn let her go, and he held his daughter and stood there in the kitchen light with the storm still working against every wall of the house, and nobody said anything for a while. That was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Evelyn knew it the way she knew most things, not from a single signal, but from an accumulation of small ones. The wind stopped finding the eaves. The sleet against the windows thinned and eventually quit. The particular pressure that a bad storm put on a house, something almost physical, like a hand pressing down on the roof, lifted by degrees until the house felt like itself again, just cold and quiet and intact. She had not slept. She'd sat in the chair beside Clara's cradle through the remaining hours of the night, not because it was strictly necessary. The fever had broken around 2 in the morning, the baby's skin cooling to something closer to normal under Evelyn's hand, but because she couldn't make herself stop watching. Old habit, maybe. Or something newer than habit. She wasn't sure there was a clean word for what kept her in that chair. Caleb had fallen asleep on the couch with his boots still on, one arm across his eyes, which was apparently how he slept when he was too exhausted to properly go to bed. Wade had taken the armchair in the corner. Sadie had been carried upstairs by her father around 1 o'clock, still half asleep, protesting faintly that she wasn't tired in the specific mumbling way of children who are deeply, totally tired. In the gray pre-dawn quiet, Evelyn sat and listened to the house breathe. Clara slept easily now, the boneless total sleep of an infant on the other side of discomfort, one small fist resting against her cheek. Her color was better. Her breathing was regular. Dr. Brewer had said she would be all right, and Evelyn had believed her in the way you believed people who dealt in facts rather than reassurance. She was all right. They had gotten to the other side of the night. Evelyn leaned her head back against the chair and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, for one unsupervised moment, how close it had been. Not the fever itself. Fevers in infants were common, manageable, the kind of thing that happened and was handled. What had been close was everything else. Caleb driving 15 miles through a blizzard on roads that would have stopped most people. The power going out. Wade coming in from whatever distance he'd ridden in ice because something had moved him to do it, whatever complicated internal math that represented. The fact that it had worked out did not make the closeness of it retroactively comfortable. She heard Wade stir in the armchair before she saw him move. He was awake the way soldiers and ranchers and people who'd spent time in rough circumstances were awake, completely and immediately. No intermediate zone of confusion. He sat up and looked at Clara's cradle first, then at Evelyn. She shook her head slightly. "She's fine." And he nodded and rubbed his jaw and looked at the gray light coming through the window. "Snow," he said quietly, so as not to wake Caleb. "How much?" 8 inches, maybe? Hard to tell yet. He stood, rolling his shoulders. "I'll check the horses before Caleb wakes up. He'll want it done." "There's coffee," Evelyn said, "if the stove's working. I'll manage." He moved through the kitchen with the careful quiet of a large man in a small space, and Evelyn listened to the sounds of him, the click of the stove igniting, the water running, the particular sound of a man who had grown up in this house, moving through it in the dark from memory. She hadn't thought about that until now. This had been Wade's house too, at some point. He'd grown up in these rooms. He knew where the coffee was kept without looking. He brought her a cup without being asked and set it on the table beside her chair and went back to the kitchen to finish his own, and Evelyn looked at the cup for a moment before picking it up. That was how the morning started. Not with the conversation, not with resolution, just coffee and a baby sleeping, and the slow arrival of a day after a night that had required a great deal from everyone. Caleb woke up at 7:30 with a start, the way people woke when they'd fallen asleep in the middle of a crisis and their body had finally, involuntarily, surrendered. He sat up and looked immediately at the cradle, and then at Evelyn, and the entire question was in his face without a word. "She's good," Evelyn said. "Slept through the last 5 hours clean. Fever's gone." He put both hands over his face and breathed in, once, slowly. Then he dropped them and stood up and went straight to the cradle and looked at his daughter for a long moment, just stood over her the way parents stood over sleeping children, checking something deeper than the visual, some internal register that only settled when they could see the chest rising and falling and know it for themselves. "You didn't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm all right. Evelyn." He said her name with a flat insistence that made her look at him. "You've been in that chair all night." "I've had worse nights," she said, which was true, and also not really the point, which she knew. He looked like he wanted to say something about that, but couldn't quite find the approach. He stood there for a moment in yesterday's clothes, with ice melt still in the creases of his boots, and his hair going in multiple directions, and he had the look of a man who was aware that something significant had happened and was trying to locate the right response in a catalog that didn't quite cover it. "Thank you," he said finally. "Just that." "You already thanked me," she said. "I'm thanking you again?" She nodded and let him have it and looked down at her coffee. Wade came back in from the barn around 8, stamping snow off his boots, and reported that the horses were fine. The water trough had frozen solid and he'd broken it up. And the south fence section that Caleb had been worried about had in fact gone down. 2 posts and a stretch of wire, but the Herefords were all accounted for, gathered in the lee of the barn where they'd apparently decided to wait out the worst of it with some self-preservation sense that cattle occasionally demonstrated. "I'll help with the fence," Caleb said. "I know you will," Wade said. "Eat something first." It was the most brotherly exchange Evelyn had witnessed between them, direct and practical and carrying, underneath it, some frequency of care that didn't require articulation. She made eggs and toast and put it on the table, and they ate, the 3 of them, with the particular quiet of people who had been through a night together and were still sorting out what to do with that. Sadie came downstairs at 8:45 in her pajamas, assessed the kitchen, determined that everyone was alive and present, and said, "Is there toast left?" "Plenty," Evelyn said. Sadie sat down. She looked at her father, then at Wade, then at Evelyn, with the long measuring look she used when she was calibrating the emotional temperature of a room. Whatever she read there seemed to satisfy her, because she reached for the toast without further interrogation. "Clara's okay?" she asked. "Clara's okay," Caleb said. Sadie buttered her toast with the concentration of someone performing surgery. "I knew she would be," she said. Nobody pointed out that she'd been terrified 6 hours ago. Evelyn just handed her the jam. The morning passed in the way mornings passed after bad nights. Slowly, in small tasks, everyone moving at 3/4 speed and not apologizing for it. Caleb and Wade went out to deal with the fence. Evelyn cleaned the kitchen properly and did a second round of laundry that the storm had disrupted. And at 10 o'clock, Clara woke up bright-eyed and vocal, and apparently entirely unaware that she had caused a considerable amount of difficulty, which Evelyn informed her of at length. "Completely inconsiderate," she told the baby. "We were all very worried." Clara made a sound that suggested indifference to this perspective. "I know," Evelyn said. "That's what I figured." It was almost noon when things shifted. Caleb had come in from the fence line alone. Wade was still out finishing the wire, and he came through the back door and stood at the kitchen sink washing his hands, and then stood there longer than washing required, looking out the window with his hands under the running water. And Evelyn recognized the particular stillness of someone who had arrived at the edge of something they'd been circling for a while. She kept doing what she was doing, which was mending a tear in Sadie's school jacket at the kitchen table. She didn't prompt him. She had learned that Caleb Hale was a man who came to things in his own sequence, and interrupting the sequence produced nothing useful. "Wade talked to me this morning," he said. "Out at the fence." She set down the jacket. "All right." He turned the water off and dried his hands with the kitchen towel, and turned around. He leaned back against the counter with his arms crossed, not defensively, just the way he stood when he was settling in for something, and looked at her directly. "He told me about Benton County," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. From the back room, Clara made a small, contented sound in her sleep. How much did he tell you? Evelyn asked. Enough. His voice was even. She couldn't read what was underneath it yet. He told me about the circumstances, about the man involved, about what you were charged with and what you served. He paused. He also told me what he knew about how it started, his part in it. She looked at her hands, then made herself look back up at him. I was 25, she said. I was in a situation I didn't know how to get out of, and I made choices I knew were wrong, and I paid for them. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm just telling you it's true. I know it's true, he said. Wade doesn't say things he isn't sure of. She waited. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, at the jacket she'd been mending, at the needle and thread still in her hand. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man doing the kind of math that didn't have clean variables. I've been thinking about what to do with this since he started talking, he said. Out there with the fence posts, hitting posts into frozen ground while he's telling me about a woman named Evelyn from a place called Benton County. A short pause. Strange conversation. I imagine, she said. I kept thinking, I should be angry. I should feel like I was deceived. He rubbed the back of his neck. Except I don't feel deceived. And I keep trying to figure out why not. And I think it's because nothing you did here ever felt like performance. He looked at her directly. You fixed the porch railing because the porch railing needed fixing. Not to impress me, not to earn anything, just because it needed doing. Caleb, I'm not finished, he said, not unkindly. I'm getting there. I'm just not fast. She stopped. He had a right to be not fast. She waited. Margaret was sick for 3 months before Clara was born, he said, and the shift in direction surprised her. She hadn't expected Margaret, not here, not now. Not the blood clot, before that. She was sick in a different way that the doctors kept running tests on and never quite naming. She was scared, and she didn't tell me how scared she was for a long time because she didn't want me to carry it. His jaw moved slightly. I found out later from her sister how frightened she'd been, how many nights she'd lain there not telling me. He stopped. She was trying to protect you, Evelyn said. She was trying to manage me, he said. Same impulse, different shape. She thought if I knew, I'd fall apart, or I'd try to fix it, or I'd... He made a short, frustrated gesture. I don't know, but she kept it from me, and then she was gone, and there were all these things I didn't know about my own wife in her last months, and I've been living with that. Evelyn said nothing. She understood that she was being told something important. She waited for it. What I'm saying, Caleb said slowly, is that I've spent the better part of a year being very aware of how much damage a kept secret does. How it makes the distance between two people that shouldn't have any distance. He looked at her. You didn't tell me about Benton County. No, she said. But you didn't lie about it either. I asked you directly, in this kitchen, if there was something I should know, and you told me there were things in your past you weren't proud of. He paused. That was the truth. It was part of the truth. Most truths are, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the Wyoming morning was pale and cold, and the snow sat on everything in soft blue shadows. And somewhere out at the fence line, she could hear the distant, regular sound of Wade driving posts. I don't know what you're deciding, Evelyn said carefully. I'm not deciding anything, he said. I already decided. I decided last night when I came home and found my daughters alive and cared for, and one of them asleep holding onto your dress, because she didn't want you to leave while she was unconscious. Evelyn's breath caught slightly. She hadn't known that. She hadn't seen it. Sadie doesn't hold on to things, Caleb said. She hasn't, since Margaret, she hasn't let herself hold on to anything. His voice had roughened at the edges. She held on to you. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Not tense, not cautious. Something more open, like a room with a window thrown up. I don't care who you were before this ranch, he said. I care who stayed. It was not a graceful sentence. He wasn't a graceful speaker. But it landed the way plain things landed, with the weight of actual meaning, not the managed presentation of it. Evelyn looked down at the table for a moment. She was again, very deliberately not crying, because crying would require her to explain why. And she wasn't sure she had language for the specific shape of what she was feeling, which was something like relief and something like terror, and something like gratitude of a quality she hadn't experienced in long enough that she'd almost stopped expecting it. There are more things, she said, about Benton County, about before it. She looked up. You should know them. All of it, not pieces of it. Okay, he said. Not today, she said. But soon. Okay, he said again. Same word, same tune, carrying the same weight. The back door opened and Wade came in, red-faced from the cold, and took in the room in one swift assessment. Whatever he read in it made him pause for just a moment at the door, hand still on the frame, looking at his brother and at Evelyn with an expression that was difficult to name. Not quite relief. Something older than relief. Something closer to a person recognizing that a mistake they made years ago has not, despite everything, destroyed what it could have destroyed. He closed the door behind him. Fence is done, he said. Good, Caleb said. Wade hung up his coat. He looked at Evelyn once more, direct, no performance, and gave a short nod. Not an apology exactly, though it carried an apology inside it, just an acknowledgement. Two people recognizing that they had come from a very different place 6 weeks ago and had arrived, through a storm and a sick baby and an honest conversation, somewhere less hostile. She nodded back. Then Sadie came downstairs holding Clara, which she was not technically supposed to do on her own, but had clearly been practicing, supporting the baby's head with the careful deliberateness of a child who had watched someone else do it enough times to believe she understood the mechanics. She was crying, Sadie said, by way of preemptive defense. Let me take her, Evelyn said, crossing the room. I've got her, Sadie said. And she did have her. Clara was perfectly secure in her sister's arms, a little uncertain looking, but unharmed and interested in the room. She just wanted to be up. Caleb looked at his daughters together, the 6-year-old holding the infant with that fierce, careful grip, Clara's hand waving toward Sadie's face with the vague purposefulness of babies exploring the world. And his expression did the thing it did sometimes when he wasn't guarding it, open, undefended, a face that held the particular exhaustion of a man who had been carrying things alone for a long time and was only beginning, slowly, to set some of them down. Wade cleared his throat. I'll start on the south water line, he said. It's probably frozen. I'll come, Caleb said. In an hour, Evelyn said. Sit down, there's food. Caleb sat down. Wade, after a brief internal negotiation visible in his jaw, sat down too. Sadie settled in her chair with Clara propped against her knees, narrating something to the baby in a low, self-important tone about the storm and the fence and various other things Clara had missed by being asleep. Evelyn made lunch. Nothing complicated. Soup from what was left, bread that had survived the night in the box, some cheese. She moved around the kitchen, and the 4 of them were at the table, and Clara was awake and making her sounds, and the snow outside was bright in the late morning sun that had finally decided to show up, and was hitting the white plains and coming through the windows at a low angle that made everything inside look warmer than it was. At one point, Sadie looked up from her narration to Clara, and looked directly at Evelyn, and said, without preamble, Are you going to leave? The table went quiet. Evelyn put down the ladle. She looked at Sadie, at her dark eyes that asked the question with everything she had. All the careful flatness gone. Just the bare question underneath it, the one she'd been asking in different forms since she was 5 years old, and her mother had gotten sick, and the world had first demonstrated its capacity for taking things. No, Evelyn said. You said that before, Sadie said, careful, testing the word. People say that. I know people say it, Evelyn said. I've said it myself in places I ended up leaving. She held Sadie's gaze. This is different. How? Evelyn thought about it. She didn't reach for the comfortable answer. She owed the child more than that. Because I'm not staying out of nowhere to go, she said. I'm staying because I want to be here. That's a different reason. It holds better. Sadie looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Clara, who had grabbed her finger again. Then she looked back at Evelyn. Okay, she said, and went back to her narration. Caleb was looking at Evelyn across the table. She met his eyes, and he held it for a moment, and then looked down at his soup, and the corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Wade said nothing. But he ate 2 full bowls, which for a man who'd arrived carrying the weight of a 6-year-old secret was, Evelyn thought, its own kind of statement. The soup was not her best work. She'd rushed the broth and the potatoes were slightly underdone, and she'd oversalted it by a margin she'd normally have caught. Nobody mentioned it. They ate it all. The conversation Evelyn had promised Caleb happened 3 days after the storm, on a Thursday evening when Sadie was in bed and Clara was sleeping and the house had settled into its night quiet. She had been putting it off. Not dishonestly. She'd told him it was coming, and he'd made clear he wasn't pressing, but the way you put off things that needed doing when you'd spent years protecting yourself from exactly this kind of exposure. Telling someone the whole truth about yourself was different from letting them see you function well. Functioning well was something she could control. Truth was not. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and said, "I'm ready if you still want to hear it." He looked up from the account book he'd been working on. The accounts were better now, marginally, and she knew this because she'd started helping him track the household expenses in a notebook she'd found in the supply drawer, not offering, just doing it and leaving it where he could see. He closed the book and pushed it aside and gave her his full attention, which was the kind of full attention that made people uncomfortable because there was no performance in it. He just looked at her and waited. She told him about growing up in a succession of foster placements across Wyoming and into Montana, none of them bad enough to be dramatic, most of them just insufficient. The specific poverty of care that wasn't abuse but wasn't really home either. She told him about leaving at 17 with nothing particular in mind, except that the system was done with her, and she was done with the system. She told him about the years in between, which were years of working bad jobs and making poor decisions, and occasionally finding people like Dolores who offered something real, and occasionally finding people who didn't. She told him about the man in Benton County, whose name was Ray Tibbet, who was older than her by 15 years, and whom she had trusted past the point where the evidence suggested trust was warranted. She did not make herself the hero of it. She didn't make herself purely the victim either, because that wasn't accurate, and she'd stopped finding comfort in inaccurate stories about herself. She had made choices. Some of them in bad circumstances and under pressure she hadn't had the tools to handle, but she had made them. The charges had been fraud-related. She had known, by the end, that what Tibbet was doing with the business they ran together was not legal, and she had kept working because she was 24 and had nowhere else and was afraid of what happened if she stepped away. When it came apart, Tibbet had documentation that placed considerably more responsibility on Evelyn than the reality warranted. He had resources she didn't, and he had Wade's employer at the time, a county official, in a position of conflict of interest that nobody had examined too closely. She had served 8 months. Tibbet had served none. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Caleb had not interrupted. He'd listened the way he did most things, completely, without telegraphing his reaction while it was forming. She watched his face now and tried to read it and couldn't entirely. "Tibbet," he said. "Yes." Wade mentioned the name, said he knew him through county work back then. His jaw tightened slightly. Said he always thought something about the whole situation was wrong and didn't do anything about it. "He told me that too," Evelyn said. "The night of the storm." Caleb was quiet again. He turned his coffee mug once, twice. "He should have," he said. Not to her specifically, just a fact being acknowledged. "People don't always," she said, "when it costs them something. That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her directly. "You've been carrying this 6 years, running from it. Running from the possibility of someone recognizing me and deciding it defined me," she said, "which is a slightly different thing." "Does it?" he asked. "Define you." She thought about the answer. Not the quick one, not the reassuring one, the real one. "Parts of who I became, yes. The 8 months. The things I saw in there, the way I thought about trust after." She paused. "But not in the way most people mean when they ask that." He nodded slowly. He was working through something. She could see it, the careful internal processing that was just how his mind moved. She waited. "I'm not a complicated man," he said finally. "I'm not going to pretend I have some big perspective on what you went through. I don't." He looked at his hands on the table. "What I have is this ranch, and 2 daughters, and a year behind me that I mostly got through by not stopping to think too hard about whether I was going to make it." He glanced up. "You walked in here and made it easier to make it. That's what I know." "Caleb, I'm not finished," he said, almost smiling. She had said that to him once. He'd remembered. She stopped. "I've been thinking about asking you something for about 3 weeks," he said. "I kept not asking it because I wasn't sure if it was too fast or too strange or too—" He stopped and made a short, frustrated gesture at the inadequacy of the available words. "I'm not good at this part." "I know," she said. "The asking part." "I know," she said again. Something was happening in her chest, not warmth exactly, more like the cautious movement of something that had been very still for a very long time. He looked at her. I'd like you to stay. Not as, not the way it's been. Differently. He held her gaze. Permanently. The words sat on the table between them. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the kitchen, the clean counter, the repaired shelves, the hooks by the door, where her jacket now hung alongside his coat, and Sadie's things, as if it had always belonged there. She looked at the man across from her, who was not an easy man and not an uncomplicated man, and not a man who had figured out how to be happy yet, and who was looking back at her with the directness she'd come to understand was just how he was. No performance, no management, just the actual thing. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I don't have a history that makes anything simple. I have 2 kids and a ranch that loses money 4 months a year, he said. I wasn't offering simple. Something that was not quite a laugh came out of her. She pressed her hand over her mouth briefly, and he watched her do it with that expression that was almost a smile, and the kitchen was very quiet around them. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It wasn't a romantic scene. There were no particular gestures. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Briefly, like a person who was still learning the vocabulary of this, and wanted to get the first word right before attempting a sentence, and then pulled it back and picked up his coffee mug, and she picked up hers, and they sat there in the quiet of a Wyoming night with snow still on the ground outside and a baby sleeping in the next room. It was enough. It was in fact more than enough. The rest of the winter passed in the way winters passed on ranches, hard and requiring. There was nothing romantic about Wyoming in December and January, nothing that softened the work, or the cold, or the specific aggravation of burst pipes and sick cattle and roads that were impassable for days at a stretch. The water line in the barn froze twice. One of the Herefords developed foot rot and required treatment for 3 weeks. Caleb's truck needed a new alternator at a cost that showed up in the account notebook as a number. They both looked at and then looked away from. Evelyn learned things about herself that winter that she hadn't known. She learned that she had more patience than she'd been giving herself credit for, and less in specific situations. She learned that she was genuinely bad at accepting help, that when Caleb tried to take over a task she was in the middle of, even helpfully, her instinct was to stiffen and manage it herself. She had to work at that. It didn't come naturally. She learned that living with a man who wasn't chatty and wasn't demonstrative, and communicated care primarily through acts, a filled gas tank, a replaced hinge, boots resoled, required her to recalibrate what attention looked like. She'd grown up in places where attention was verbal or it didn't exist. She had to learn to read a different language. Caleb, for his part, learned that she needed to know things weren't fragile before she trusted them. That the first time they argued, a real argument in February, about money and about her tendency to solve problems without consulting him and about his tendency to absorb stress in silence until it came out sideways. She went very still and very contained in a way that looked like calm, but wasn't. He had to learn to stay in the room when she went still like that, to not let the apparent calm convince him that nothing was happening. The argument was about real things, and it was ugly for about 40 minutes, and afterward they were both standing in the kitchen being separately quiet, and then Caleb said, "I'm not going anywhere," which was not a particularly eloquent statement, but it was the right one. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I know." And whether she fully believed it yet or not, she was working on it. That was February. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in Wyoming, not arriving so much as gradually winning an argument. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, leaving behind the wet brown aftermath of winter, and then the grass began its cautious return, and by April the plains had that particular color they got in early spring, that just alive green that made the whole landscape look like it was surprised to be back. Wade came around more that spring. Not constantly. He had his own life, his own property 20 miles south, the particular isolated rhythms of a bachelor rancher, but regularly enough that his truck in the yard stopped being notable. He and Caleb were in a different place than they'd been. Whatever had passed between them the night of the storm, and in the fence line conversation the following morning, had shifted the geography of their relationship in some way that neither of them discussed, and both of them apparently understood. I was careful with Evelyn. Not warm, exactly. He wasn't built for easy warmth with people he'd initially been suspicious of, but respectful in a specific way, the way you were respectful toward someone you'd underestimated and were aware you'd underestimated. He helped with the spring fence work. He brought a part for the tractor that Caleb had been waiting 3 weeks for, without explanation about how he'd sourced it. Once, He watched Evelyn fix a broken gate latch without being asked to, and when she finished, he said, "That's better than I would have done it," and walked off, which was, she had come to understand, Wade's version of a substantial compliment. She didn't seek his approval. She didn't need it. But she understood that it meant something, his presence, his slowly changing stance, and she received it in the spirit it was offered, which was a man working through his own complicated feelings about the past and arriving, imperfectly, somewhere better. The wedding was in June, which was a practical choice as much as anything else. June was the best weather and the longest days, and the narrow window before the July heat made everything uncomfortable. They told people a month in advance, and that was that. There was no elaborate planning. Evelyn didn't have family to invite, and Caleb's family was Wade and a cousin in Billings who came down for the day and cried through the whole thing, which surprised everyone, including herself. The ceremony happened in the yard in the late afternoon, with the plains stretching out in every direction under a sky that was that particular blue Wyoming sky. Saturated, enormous, the kind of sky that made you aware of exactly how small the human arrangements below it were. There were 14 people total, counting Sadie and Clara, who was now 8 months old and attempting to stand by holding on to whatever presented itself, including the hem of Evelyn's dress, which she did at the worst possible moment. The officiant was a justice of the peace from Milford named Herbert, who had been doing this for 30 years, and had the comfortable efficiency of someone who respected the weight of the occasion without being theatrical about it. He asked Caleb if he took Evelyn to be his wife, and Caleb said, "I do," in the flat, certain way he said everything he meant. He asked Evelyn the same thing, and she said, "I do." And her voice only caught slightly, and nobody commented on it. Then Herbert asked, as part of the ceremony, for Caleb to speak briefly on what this commitment meant to him, which had been his idea and which Evelyn had spent 2 weeks gently dreading, because Caleb's relationship with public expression was not uncomplicated. He stood beside her in his good shirt, which was a flannel, because this was Wyoming, and who wore suits in Wyoming in June. And he looked at the 14 people standing in his yard and at the sky, and then at Evelyn, and he was visibly uncomfortable in the way of a man who had not prepared a speech and was not going to pretend he had. "I'm not good at this part," he said. Several people smiled. "She knows that," he added, which got a real laugh. He looked at Evelyn. "I'm staying," he said. That ought to mean something. It wasn't a declaration of grand passion. It wasn't poetry. It was a man who had meant every word he'd ever said to her, and who was saying this one the same way. It meant everything. Evelyn laughed, an actual laugh, surprised out of her, not managed. And Herbert pronounced them married, and Sadie, who had been standing beside Evelyn for the entire ceremony holding Clara's hand, as if she'd appointed herself the family's structural engineer, said in a carrying whisper, "Finally." There was food after. Neighbors had brought things. Casseroles, a pie from Darlene at the truck stop, who had driven out despite not being formally invited, which Evelyn found she wasn't even slightly upset about. Someone brought beer. Someone else brought a fiddle and played badly for an hour, and nobody told them to stop because it was that kind of afternoon. Wade stood at the edge of the yard through most of it with a beer in his hand, watching. At one point he came to stand beside Evelyn while Caleb was occupied with the cousin from Billings. "He's better," Wade said. "He is," Evelyn said. "So is Sadie." He looked at his niece, who was currently attempting to teach Clara how grass worked, which Clara found extremely interesting. She laughs again. I wasn't sure she was going to get back to that." Evelyn looked at Sadie, too. At the loose braid she'd done this morning, coming apart at the back already, and the serious expression she wore while explaining the grass to Clara, and the way she'd told Evelyn last week, without particular emotion, that she thought the bean soup was better than it used to be, which Evelyn understood to mean, "You have become part of this. The recipes are yours now, too." "She did it herself," Evelyn said. "I just didn't leave." Wade was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." He nodded, drank his beer, went back to the edge of the yard. The afternoon stretched long and golden, the way June afternoons in Wyoming could, the sun taking its time about setting, the light going amber and then red across the plains. People drifted away in ones and twos back to their own ranches and their own lives, and the yard gradually returned to itself. Someone helped clear the tables without being asked. Herbert drove away and waved from the window of his car. Eventually, it was just the family. Caleb carried Clara on one hip and stood in the yard looking at the remains of the afternoon, folding chairs, a half-eaten pie. grass bent by a day of people standing on it. He looked like a man taking inventory of something he was choosing to feel good about, which was not his natural orientation, and the choosing was visible in his face. Sadie was sitting on the porch steps with her shoes off and her braid entirely destroyed, one knee drawn up, watching the plains. Evelyn sat beside her. They were quiet for a while. The evening sounds came in, the horses in the paddock, a meadowlark somewhere in the distance, the particular settling quiet of a ranch at the end of a day. "Do you miss anywhere?" Sadie asked. Evelyn thought about it. "I miss a person," she said. "Dolores, she died a few years ago." "Was she like family?" "She was exactly like family. She was a woman who made biscuits and fed people and let them stay when they needed to." Evelyn looked at the plains. She would have liked this place. Sadie considered this. "Do you think she would have liked us?" "I think she would have loved you specifically," Evelyn said. She had very high regard for people who spoke their mind and didn't pretend to feel things they didn't. Sadie seemed to accept this as a reasonable compliment. She rested her chin on her knee and looked out at the light on the grass. "I'm glad you heard Clara crying," she said. "That first day." Evelyn looked at her. Sadie wasn't looking back. She was still watching the plains, her profile serious, like a small person saying something that mattered and not wanting to make too much of it. "Me too," Evelyn said. There were things she might have said, things about how close she'd come to not stopping, about the $43 at the bottom of a bag that she'd eventually donated to the donation box at the Milford Library without ceremony, about all the versions of herself she'd been before this one, and the specific cost of becoming each of them. She might have said something about how she'd thought for most of her life that the only way to protect yourself was to keep moving, to never let yourself matter to a place, or let a place matter to you, and how completely and empirically wrong that had turned out to be. She didn't say any of it. Sadie was 7 and didn't need a monologue, and some things were better understood as living than as language. Caleb came and sat on the step below them. Clara settled in his lap, and Clara immediately tried to eat his collar, which she had been doing for 3 weeks as some kind of project. He extracted the collar from her mouth without looking, from pure practice. The sky went dark at the edges first, and then overhead, slow and inevitable, the stars coming in over the plains in their enormous Wyoming numbers, more stars than any city person believed existed until they stood under a sky like this and looked up. Sadie eventually fell asleep against Evelyn's arm. She didn't fight it, just went, the way children went when they were finally in a place that felt safe enough to stop watching. Caleb looked at his daughter sleeping against his wife's arm, and then looked at Evelyn, and she looked back, and there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. She thought about a truck stop outside Rawlins, a sign that said, "No loitering," a cup of cold coffee, and a map with a star on it that said, "Here," unfortunately. She thought about 4 miles of bad road and a sound cutting through the cold and a door opening onto a man who hadn't slept in a week, and a baby who wouldn't stop screaming. She thought about every road out of every place she'd ever been. She'd known them all. She'd driven or walked most of them. She hadn't taken this one. There was a version of herself, not so different, not so far away, who had finished that coffee and walked the other direction entirely, who had made the practical calculation that a crying baby was someone else's problem, that stopping was a risk, that the next town had better odds than this road leading nowhere. She had been that version of herself many times, in many places, and the woman she'd been in those moments was not a villain. She was just a person who had run out of the particular resource required for staying. What she knew now, that she hadn't known then, was what the resource actually was. It wasn't courage in the heroic sense. It wasn't selflessness. It was something simpler and harder than either of those. The willingness to let something matter. To decide that a place and the people in it were worth the risk of losing them. To build something knowing it could break. Because the alternative, building nothing, risking nothing, losing nothing, was its own kind of destruction, just slower, just quieter. She had almost walked past a dying house on a Wyoming highway. She had almost let the running be the whole story. The stars came fully out over Hollow Creek, and the plains were enormous and silent in every direction, and inside the house the wood stove was putting out heat, and outside on the porch steps a family sat in the particular quiet of people who had come to the end of a hard day and found themselves, against various odds, still together. Some things didn't need a better ending than that.